Hi, everyone. So glad to be here with you today. We are kicking off the Wondermind Lonely Together workshop series. I'm Dr. Jenny Wang. I'm a clinical psychologist, speaker, and author. And today, our topic is going to be alone but not lonely, how to freaking love your own company. Thank you for joining us. I feel like if you are here with us today, you're here for a reason. And I can't wait to learn and explore with you on this really important topic because loneliness is something that so many of us struggle with. So let's explore. Let's start with our set point. Let's start with where we're walking into this room. So when you think about being lonely, what are the emotions that you experience? And feel free to type it in the chat because I kind of want to hear, what do you feel when you think about being lonely or alone? And I'm going to click over so I can see your chat responses. But this is something that is so important when we think about this idea of loneliness. Because when you think about being alone, it triggers something in each of us. And so I'm seeing in the chat, there's responses of sadness, insecure, sad, anxiety, sadness, wow, ooh, shame. Someone mentioned shame as well. Heavy, shame. I'm going to read these out to y'all because I feel like we all need to hear how each of us feels when we think about being alone or lonely. So I see words like insecure, anxiety, or sadness. I'm also seeing despair, uncomfortable, fail, low mood, desperation, panic. Y'all, these are so important for us to name. I'm also seeing empty. So notice how so many of these emotion words that are conjured up when we think about being alone are negative. They're uncomfortable. In some cases, they're even painful. Someone just mentioned not good enough, not belonging. And so this is really important for us to name because I always like to come back to this quote by William Shakespeare in the play Hamlet. He says, "There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so." Now sit with that for a second. What Shakespeare is saying is that in all situations, no matter what life throws at you, it's not necessarily good or bad. It's actually our interpretation that makes it so. And so notice how for so many of us, when we think about being alone or lonely, we automatically think about or feel these negative emotions. And this is so important for us to unpack. So if you have a piece of paper near you and a pen, or even kind of the notes app in your phone, I want you to think about this first question and maybe jot it down so you can do this after the workshop today. And this first question is, now that I've identified the emotion that comes up when I think about being alone, what are the stories that are contributing or creating this emotion in myself when I think about being alone? Because for so many of us, being alone wasn't a neutral experience. Being alone might have been something in which we felt as a child. Perhaps our parents worked a lot. Perhaps our parents weren't present. Being alone could have also meant that you didn't belong, maybe amongst your classmates, your peers. So that narrative that being alone was perhaps a negative thing and associated with negative emotion came from somewhere. And I think it is so important for us to understand what that story is so that we can start to unpack and unlearn that story going forward. Because the only way we can approach being alone with a sense of neutrality or even a sense of positive emotion, is if we're able to identify the stories that make it feel so, so hard, which many of you have shared in the chat. So thank you all for doing that. So let's think about, right, where could some of these negative stories have come from? For some of us, these stories came from outside of us. Maybe people told us, "Why are you such a loner? Why don't you have any friends?" Or maybe they were personality things. We were a little bit more shy when we were younger, and maybe still are. Or maybe they came from an environment in which people didn't seem to notice us. We didn't feel seen, we didn't feel heard. And so being alone was a really scary act because it meant that we were maybe invisible. So these are all examples of how these stories start to shape our experience of being alone. I always tell my clients, sometimes it's the lens. It's almost like you put on a pair of glasses that are this gray tint. And so now when we look through the glasses into our world, and in this case, at the idea of being alone, it tints everything, right, with this negative interpretation. And so, what are those negative interpretations? And I hope you'll take time to investigate those stories and also those interpretations and think about perhaps the roots of some of those stories. So, one of the things I always like to invite people to think about is, what is your personal set point in terms of aloneness and being lonely? And so, this idea of aloneness is the physical act of being on your own, right? And that's something that so many of us experience in different parts of our lives. Maybe we work alone, right? We work on our own most of the time. Or when you go to the bathroom, you are physically alone. But we don't always have a negative feeling or interpretation when we're physically alone. And so we have this idea of aloneness, the very act of not being around other people. And then we have this idea of being lonely, where being physically alone or being surrounded by people still makes us feel as though we're not seen, we're not heard, we're not being valued. And that is the other side of the spectrum of this, where it becomes a sense of loneliness. It's not just being physically on our own. It is the idea that I'm alone or perhaps surrounded by people, but nobody sees me. Nobody values me. And so for each of us, we have a different set point on that spectrum, right? For an introvert like me, that aloneness is actually a time that I look forward to sometimes because I've been overstimulated by the outside world. And so I need to approach life with a little more boundaries, and I need to step away. I need to not talk to people for a few hours. And that aloneness is actually a welcome change in my life. But then there are also times where I'm alone and I feel it like an ache in my belly. And I feel as though nobody notices that I'm not there. Nobody's invited me to things. No one has welcomed me to their table, to their community, to their space. And that loneliness is palpable and it's hurtful or painful. So take a moment right now and think in this spectrum. Let's say aloneness, right, is 0, and loneliness, the ache of being alone, is a 10. Where do you feel like your sweet spot is between that? And feel free to share it in the chat just because I love to hear from you all. Where do you feel most at peace? Where do you feel calm in that spectrum of 0 to 10? 0 being in solitude And I'm totally cool with that. And that's my natural set point. And then 10 being, ooh, I'm in this ache of loneliness, and that feels too intense for me to tolerate. So somebody shared their kind of natural set point is a 4 or a 5. So a nice balance of I need time with people and I also need time for solitude. A couple more people said 4. So you're kind of on the lower average range of I need some alone time, right? Now somebody else said 10. Somebody else said 7, meaning that they actually are craving more social interaction, right? And if they are not getting it, then they're feeling the ache. We also have people in the 5, 6, 7 range. So notice how even in a group like this, we can have such different set points of where we feel at peace in relationship to ourselves and others. And that is so important to know because we are so different in the ways that we crave human interaction and the ways that we also crave alone time. And that's so important for us to know because then that tells us that that set point of human connection and need, where that falls in this range. And it is a place that we can begin to work and to really understand how do we build for a way to find our way back to that set point, right? So something to think about is when we're alone, for a lot of us, it brings up a lot of negative emotion. When we're alone, it also brings up emotional discomfort that some of us have a hard time tolerating. I have some clients who, when they're alone, they actually feel an increase in anxiety or they feel an increase of depression symptoms. I also have clients where when they're alone, the quietness makes it such that their negative emotion that they've been trying so hard to tune out comes to the surface. And so, if you think about it, sometimes our sense of busyness or avoidance of aloneness is also because it forces us to confront some things that we don't feel ready to confront yet, be it situations or emotions in our lives. And so that's another thing I invite you to jot down if you have a piece of paper. Is there something that pushes through the surface when I'm alone that I don't want to hear or acknowledge? And that's why being alone is so difficult for me. And so I invite you to consider what might actually come through the surface when you're alone, because I think that's also important to understand. So I'm alone. Now what? How can we learn to be alone well? And I think one of the first things that we need in our lives as a skill is to understand how to regulate emotional dysregulation. And all that means is the feeling that we get when we feel uncomfortable, sad, bored, right? Disappointed, frustrated, angry. Anytime our emotions move out of our homeostasis or kind of our normal neutral state, the mind then pays attention and says, ugh, there's something negative here, and we need to figure out what to do next. Our first inclination when we feel negative emotion, though, is to suppress it, to avoid it, to live with blinders on. And so when you feel those things when you're alone, is it social anxiety, right? Is it depression? Is it perhaps a history of trauma? What lives in that space of not being able to tolerate that emotional dysregulation? That's something that I would invite you to consider, maybe even talk to your mental health professional around. if that's something that comes to the surface for you. Someone just shared, my inner critic definitely comes to the surface when I'm alone. And yes, for so many of us, that inner critic is a voice that eats away at our self-esteem and eats away at our ability to live with a sense of peace. And so, if that is where a lot of that negative emotion comes from, then there are tools that we can use to combat, right, these negative critic emotions. So, that's one thing to think about is why is it so hard for me to regulate my emotional life when I'm feeling alone? Now, another thing to think about is what is the context specific interpretation, right, when we're alone? And what I mean by that is when you go to a bathroom, to a restroom alone, right, do you feel badly? Do you think to yourself, oh, nobody notices that I'm gone, or nobody realizes that I'm missing, nobody cares about me, or I feel sad? Maybe not, right? Because generally it would be expected that you would go to the restroom alone. And that context doesn't warrant an interpretation of why you're alone. But let's say you show up to a party or a gathering and you are alone. What are some interpretations that might rise to the surface in that context? What are the emotions that are getting triggered in that context? Right? So notice how even the context that you are in shapes how you interpret whether or not being alone is something that is normalized and okay, or something that brings up a lot of negative emotion or self criticism and judgment, right? So, in those contexts, do you catastrophize about this idea of being alone? Meaning, you take the idea of being alone and think to yourself, oh my gosh, I came here alone, and that means I have no friends, and I'm never going to make new friends, and I'm always going to be alone for the rest of my life. Notice how it's taking that one singular moment and maximally, right, catastrophizing that situation to all areas and into the future of your life. Notice how that is so important, right, to be able to be aware of so we can combat, right, a lot of those negative emotions that come up. And then I think another thing we need to think about is how do we think about ourselves in relation to other people? Do we derive a sense of connection, belonging, value, or worth with being connected to others? Because if we heavily see ourselves as only valuable in the context of others, then yeah, you're going to judge yourself if you're alone for a lot of your daily life, right? But if you see yourself as somebody who can navigate being alone, and I still have value, I still have worth, I still have meaning in my life, and when I'm with other people, I'm still very much have value, still very much have worth, right? Then my interpretation will also be really different, right? So there are a lot of people commenting about if we feel better alone than when we are with people, what does that mean? Or I enjoy solitude a lot because it's the easiest way to exist for myself. Ooh. Another person says, I love being alone so much that I completely isolate myself. And this is that perfect analogy for how, as human beings, we have to navigate the balance between connection to others and also priority of self. And for each of us, that set point is really different, right? Which is why I asked you earlier to identify that set point. For some of us, we will tip towards wanting to be alone as our preferred state, but then sometimes realizing that, ooh, when I'm alone too long, that actually is not good for my mental health. Or when I'm stressed and activated, I actually tend towards isolation, which also is not good for my mental health because then a lot of those stories can get activated and kicked up. So, knowing where I thrive in that balance of self and other becomes such an important part of how we evaluate what we do next. And when I say what we do next, what I mean is that all of us at some point may tend towards inertia or traction. Inertia is I've been alone for so many days. I haven't maybe left my apartment for so long that I don't feel like moving. I don't feel like scheduling dinner with friends. I don't feel like getting out of the house. Maybe because of social anxiety, maybe because I'm in a depressive episode. Who knows, right? But that inertia and that unwillingness to get out of the home or house should be a yellow flag that says, hey, you need to pay attention because if I keep going down this path, I might actually feel worse. The other side of the spectrum is I'm out, I'm doing things with people so much that I'm burnt out. And that should also be a flag that that balance of self versus other is starting to get off kilter. And knowing where we are at each point in time helps us recalibrate that balance. So that's something that's really important and that we need to think about. And so something that we have to think about is, do you mean we could actually enjoy being alone? Right? That there might be a place in my life where being alone could actually be something that I actually relish, that I actually value. And this comes down to our value sets and our intentions with our time. When we think about each season of our lives, we might have times where we want more togetherness and connection. And we also might have seasons where we want more separateness and more boundaries between ourselves and others. And so enjoying aloneness or connectedness means finding that sweet spot. And when we notice we're outside of that sweet spot, figuring how to rein it back in intentionally. It also means that we have a choice in how we interpret our aloneness, right? So when we're thinking about being alone, if it's something that I'm choosing, that feels very different. And it comes from an empowered place when I choose to be alone versus I'm alone because everybody else is busy. I haven't been invited to things and I'm feeling the FOMO, right? So, in times where you are feeling like you're alone, choosing how you interpret that posture and that sense of agency matters because it shapes how you're going to view yourself. And when you are alone, I'm a big proponent that we have to cultivate that alone time. Imagine your alone space as a garden, and you get to choose what grows in that garden. You can sow seeds of discontent. You can sow narratives of self-criticism in that garden, or you can plant seeds where it is a time of growth, learning, creativity, exploration, right? You get to choose what grows in that space when you are alone. And so many of us, we don't actually think that we have to cultivate that. We just let whatever patterns of thought fill that alone time and space. And often those are negative. And so being alone becomes such a tricky time for each of us, right? And then finally, could we see our solitude and time alone as actually the fuel for our times of connection? Especially if you are more introverted, or some of you shared that you like being on your own sometimes, probably sometimes too much. Could you think of this time alone as the necessary restoration of yourself, such that when you show up into the world again and you are interfacing with people, you have an overflow of resources, of energy, of emotional connection, because you've taken the time to tend that garden within yourself. And so, therefore, you don't need to think of yourself as being alone and that coming from a place of lack. But that being alone is the reason why you have more to give when you're around other people. And think about what it would look like in this world if all of us met each other from a place of emotional abundance, because we've taken the time to take care of ourselves in our times of solitude. So then the question is, when you leave here today, what are the tangible things that you can work on, right? To really start to cultivate that garden, that solitude, that aloneness, and start to reframe that experience for yourself. First thing I would say is confront and interrogate your frameworks and stories. Start there. Understand the story that you're telling yourself, and maybe find a new story, because that will define how you meet that aloneness each and every time you come back to that place. Number 2 is understand your needs. Where is your set point in terms of connection versus solitude? Where do you want to live that feels like a nice balance between the two? And once you understand that set point and need, then when you start to feel the imbalance, what are the actions that you can put around that season of time to then move yourself towards greater balance? Think of those yellow and red flags, right? When I am too interactive with people and I'm in that mode of being too extroverted, my yellow and red flag is resentment. I start to feel resentful that I have to give myself in a way that feels exhausting. And so that's my flag that says, Jenny, you need to start saying no to stuff, because if you keep going, you will burn out. And so what are some of those yellow and red flags for you that are giving you warning signs that something feels off balance? And then what are the action plans that you're going to put in place to help you find yourself back to that grounded, peaceful place? And then also, if you have a hard time tolerating the emotional discomfort of being alone, then can you actually schedule short, manageable bursts of time where you're alone and start practicing confronting the stories, self-soothing through the sadness, the disappointment, the loneliness, learning how to extend your ability to tolerate those times? Because sometimes that feeling of sadness comes up just in the beginning or briefly. And if you can soothe that negative emotion enough to help you turn on the front part of your brain, the cognitive part, then it's enough for you to then go out and do something for yourself, or think about how you want to cultivate, right, that solitude kind of garden. So often it's the first few minutes, maybe 30 minutes of time of discomfort. Can you learn how to tolerate and soothe through that enough such that then you can get to the other side, which is actually enjoying that time of solitude and being alone? So thank you so much. There are so many amazing questions in this chat. So we're going to move towards the Q&A section. And let's talk. Let's kind of get through some of the questions that had come up during this time. So let's see. Okay, so I think some of the questions are getting pulled through. So someone said, what are other ways to be alone at home without mindlessly scrolling on social media or binge watching TV? And this is such a good question because something we need to realize is that this solitude time, I hope for a lot of us, is about restoration, right? It's about recharging. But there are different types of actions that are reflective of rest. And I kind of group them into two different categories. The first being a sense of restorative rest, right? So these are the actions that you take that when you're done with it, you're actually feeling like, ooh, I feel refreshed. I feel like I could go out and do something. I feel as though I'm ready to engage the world. And that's what I would consider restorative rest. But the mindless scrolling and binge watching TV, that's what I consider dissociative rest. The rest that I engage in because I'm kind of bored or wanting to avoid some negative emotion or something that feels really hard in my life. And so I'm actually scrolling because I'm trying to distract my mind from something that feels really hard or trying to protect my mind from negative emotion. And so the dissociative rest, while it can kind of be relieving in the short term because it gives our mind the ability to kind of like set it on the shelf and do something for a while, it doesn't actually bring a sense of restoration though. Because at the end of the day, the thing we're avoiding is always sitting at the back of our minds, right? And so, in order to move towards more restorative rest, I would think about things that you engage in where time seems to stand still or speed up. Right? Psychologically, we call this like a flow state. So it is an activity. For me, it's like crafting, making jewelry, baking. It's something that I do that, doesn't necessarily have to have an outcome, but at the end of it, I feel like there's been a sense of replenishment. For some people, it's exercise. For others, right, it's something where it's almost like a repetitive motion, like knitting or something like that, where they feel as though at the end of it, the mind was fully engaged, but they also didn't feel like it was so much effort that they're exhausted. And so think about that, right? When you're trending towards the dissociative rest, what is something that you could actually do that moves your rest into the restorative zone? So thank you for the question. Let's see. How do you cope with being alone? And I would say that coping with being alone first has to begin with what is the emotion or the negative response that you're having to protect from or cope with, right? So for a lot of people earlier in the chat, you mentioned that when you think about being alone, you feel uncomfortable, you feel despair, you feel anxiety or sadness. And when that comes up for a lot of us, we then start like this rabbit hole thought process, right, of things that feed those emotions. Something to think about is that when an emotion arises, oftentimes it doesn't necessarily last for a super long time. You feel the emotional rush, you feel the wave of it, and eventually it subsides. And so, coping with being alone, even if it brings up a strong negative reaction, can simply be, right, engaging in diaphragmatic or deep breathing through the time where the anxiety ramps up, just long enough so that you can calm your nervous system to be able to then get to the other side of being able to say, oh, wait, I felt so much intense anxiety or sadness, but that doesn't have to be where I stay when I'm alone. And once you can calm the nervous system down and get to the other side, then I hope at the end of this, you've developed your list of actions that you can do. Maybe it's to go for a walk outside by yourself and listen to some great music, or to make yourself a sandwich and be aware of every single moment of that activity. a lot of times a sense of mindfulness or even being in our sensory experience helps take us out of the emotional activation of being alone. Naming 5 things that you see in your room that are green, right? Or smelling something that brings a sense of calm, such as lavender or the smell of a perfume that you love. Those sensory experiences are also very grounding to the nervous system and can help you cope with that initial surge of negative emotion. So, great question. What activities do you recommend if we're trying to embrace doing things alone? I would say that we are all so different in activities that bring a sense of restoration or grounding. But, think of things where you wouldn't mind doing them alone, right? So, for example, going to a party alone for me as an introvert is super activating. That's not an activity that I would recommend doing, right? So, think about, will this activity lead me to more calmness? More regulated nervous system? Will this activity help me move towards even an emotion of joy or pleasure? Those are the things that I would recommend doing, especially if you struggle with being alone. Because what we're doing is now pairing the act of being alone with a positive emotion, right? So, it might be going to your favorite shop, right? And browsing all the beautiful items. Maybe you love plants and going and doing some plant shopping or window shopping. What are things that naturally bring you a sense of pleasure and ease and joy? Those are the things that I would recommend doing alone. A question that came up is, how can one that has emotional attachment from traumatic past experiences feel at comfort and find peace when alone? Absolutely. So, in individuals who've had past trauma or experiences that make them feel unsafe being alone, the act of being alone can be very activating and triggering. And I would actually say that in those times where you want to practice being alone, I would be very intentional about building out rituals of safety, rituals of grounding. So maybe it's, I'm going to practice being alone for the next 30 minutes. And I know this feels so structured, but for some of us, that can be really helpful. Maybe I start this 30 minutes by taking a hot shower and then lighting a candle, making my favorite cup of tea, right? Putting some music that I really enjoy on. This action of building out these rituals and sensory cues each time can help calm the nervous system so that each time you practice it, the mind is able to more easily go into a calmer state where you feel safer. And when you think about it, right, trauma is a felt sense that I am not safe. And so building around your environment, right, where you're able to increase the sense of safety, even if you're a tactile person, right? Grab your favorite large stuffed animal or your pillow, right? And have that as something that is part of your sensory grounding when you're alone. That is what I would recommend. And sometimes, and I know this is a talk about being alone, but sometimes the practice of being alone may start with the support of a loving person. And maybe it's just like FaceTiming a friend for the first few minutes of that alone time, and then being able to close out that call and enter into that alone practice with a little bit more grounding. Let's see. Somebody says, would you consider music podcasts another example of dissociative rest? Are they also distractions from unwanted feelings? This is such a great question because I'm also a big podcast listener. And I think something to be mindful of is, are you fully engaged when you're listening to music or the podcast, right? Because dissociative rest is actually a disengagement, right? So my mind trying to detach from something, and that is actually a way to cope. But if you're listening to the podcast and you're mentally engaged and you're like, this is so interesting, and you're connecting thoughts in your mind and you're feeling like you're really learning, then I don't know that I would consider that dissociative because I'm actually engaged with the content, right? But if you're listening to the podcast, but during that time, your mind is going to 10 different places and you're thinking about what you're eating for dinner and you're not actually listening to the podcast, then that might fall in the dissociative category. It's just a stimuli, right? That the mind is just kind of fluttering away with. And so I would use the idea of engagement, cognitive or mental engagement, as a sense of whether or not you're dissociating or you're engaged or in the restorative rest mode. What can I do when the pit of my stomach has an emptiness that I cannot describe and it's not hunger? So, I actually have a lot of clients who describe this feeling. And sometimes they're individuals who either struggle with attachment. Kind of relationships in their life, or there is a long-standing history sometimes of depression, even, right? So individuals who, when they're not feeling well, they feel a deep sense of emptiness. And I would say that this is a very normal reaction, especially if, you've had attachment trauma or complex relationships in the past. And could you allow yourself to notice the emptiness, name kind of what lives around the emptiness, and realize that that emptiness is not going to hurt you or harm you, but that you can also take action even in the midst of the loneliness or the emptiness. And what I mean by taking action is you can feel an emptiness and you can still pick an activity or an action that you can do during your aloneness and realize that it can sit side by side with that emptiness. Sometimes the action alleviates the emptiness a little bit. Sometimes it distracts from the emptiness. And other times it just sits right next to it, and that's okay, right? That we are going to have times in our lives where a difficult or negative emotion sits beside tangible actions that we take to move ourselves through that hard emotion, and that is normal and that it is a part of this experience of being human and feeling a lot of complex emotions at the same time. Any tips or advice for quieting your mind when you are alone? It is easy to distract or fill your thoughts with work when away from home, but how can you quiet the nonstop anxious thoughts when you're alone? Great question. I think so many of us struggle with anxiety. And I heard something the other day that I thought was really interesting. Somebody said the opposite of anxiety isn't the lack of anxiety. The opposite of anxiety is presence. And I thought that was really interesting because anxiety often is when the mind almost leaves the physical here and now and starts to worry about what if something in the future, or what if something in the past, what if I could have changed this, right? There's something about anxiety where it takes us away from a sense of mindfulness, which is a full embodying of a here and now presence. And so one practice that I have clients work through is this idea that when the anxious thought comes up, you actually have a choice on whether or not you decide to live there with that anxious thought. And just like how you can notice, oh, the sky is blue. Okay, the sky is blue. That's a thought, just like an anxious thought, but you have no strong reaction to it. There's no strong emotion to it, right? The reason why an anxious thought sticks around is because there's an emotional loading or charge that lives with that emotional or anxious thought. And so when the anxious thought arises, can you actually allow yourself to zoom out and away from it and actually walk around it and say, oh, I'm feeling really anxious. That's another anxious thought that has come up. And I can choose to stay with this anxious thought and keep giving it more attention and focus. Or I can also choose to Notice that the light in my room is really bright, and it's actually too bright for how I'm experiencing it right now. I'm going to go turn it down. The ability to control the focus of your attention can be so powerful in managing anxious or negative thoughts. And so we're not trying to change that anxious thought into a positive one or a non anxious one. We're simply cueing the mind to say, "Oh, I see you, anxious thought. And now I'm actually just going to walk into a different part of my mind and focus on another thought." All right. I'm not sure how we're doing on time. I think we might need to wrap up, but let's see. We'll do one more and then we'll close out our time together. I wish we could get through all of these questions. They are so good. But let's see. The last one is how to politely tell someone to F off if they force you to do extroverted stuff when you feel that you need to be alone or take some time to think about whether or not you want to participate in such activities. Ooh, great question, because I feel that deeply as an introvert myself. I would say that I would nicely tell them that I just don't really have capacity right now to do that extroverted thing that I'm being invited to do. That, I really just need some time to disconnect and recharge. And I think when we tell people that it's not about desire, it's not about time, it's just about our capacity, right? And when I don't have capacity, I really don't show up well. I actually show up in social situations super awkward and really annoyed that I'm there. And so, if anything, you politely declining and setting that boundary is actually a gift to them too, because they probably want to hang out with you when you're feeling engaged and wanting to be there. And so, I would say, I just don't have capacity right now. And certainly let me know next time, but I think I'm going to tap out on this one. So, thank you all so much for spending time with me today. It has been such a pleasure to be with you. I hope that you're able to think about some of those frameworks, challenge some of those stories, and also consider how you want to nurture this garden of solitude and actually make it a place that is really attractive for you to go to when you're wanting to be alone. So, thank you all so much. And hopefully, we will get a chance to chat soon.